All right, let's talk about the Russian Revolution. It's really one of the most influential events in the 20th century. It transforms Russia, obviously, and eventually Eastern Europe. It resets the balance of power and the diplomatic and military situation in Europe after the First World War and sets up the Second World War. It also sets up, of course, the Cold War, the defining geopolitical struggle in the second half of the 20th century. And also in the second half of the 20th century, it really profoundly affects the dynamic of the whole decolonization movement that Africa and Asia go through following the Second World War, with some of these countries, as they're getting independence, turning to the Soviet Union as their model and for military and economic support. And obviously, this defines a number of conflicts during the Cold War between the West and the Soviet-dominated world. What I'd like to focus on in this discussion here is the way the Russian Revolution follows a pattern very similar to what the French Revolution follows, as laid out in, of course, Crane Britton's famous work, Anatomy of a Revolution. So let's take a look at the origins of the revolution and the patterns that it follows, and maybe discuss a little bit some of the effects of the revolution, the immediate effects. So before we get into the specific causes for the revolution, the long-term and short-term causes, let's just take a quick look at the revolution itself, put it in time and space here. So the revolution takes place in 1917 during World War I, takes place in Russia, obviously, as Russia is collapsing during that war. And it starts out as kind of a spontaneous event, but quickly the communists, the Bolsheviks, take control and turn the revolution in a certain pathway and drive it in a certain direction. So, as with all major events, this doesn't spring out of nothing. It doesn't spring out of thin air here. There are long-term causes of the Russian Revolution. There are things that have been going on for quite some time that paved the way for this major revolution. And one of these is the so-called land hunger of the peasants. Russia in the early 20th century is still pretty medieval, with the nobles controlling the land, and the peasants, although they've been emancipated in the late mid-19th century, they still don't have, most of them, the land that they desire, and the land they have is poorer quality. They don't really have the independence they want. And so you have this peasant class that's just desperate for change. You also have, of course, the inherent problems with an autocracy, which is sooner or later you're going to get a weak ruler. And Nicholas II, like Charles I in England, like Louis XVI in France, he's a weak ruler, and he just can't hold it together when a crisis comes. Russia also has a long history of rebellion in the 17th century, Stephen Razine's rebellion in the 18th century, Pugachev's rebellion. In the 19th century, you have the Decembrist revolt, and you have the anarchist movement. And so there is a strong tendency towards violent revolution in Russia. And finally, there's a lack of any kind of safety valve. There's no way for people to express their will or appeal to the government. And this causes tensions to just build up to the point where they eventually explode. Now, there was an earlier crisis that Nicholas II had managed to avoid. There was a revolution in 1905 following the Russian defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, and Nicholas II had avoided serious problems by promising some reforms, but unfortunately he immediately goes back on his word. And he is really surrounded by people that are unpopular. The image on the lower right is a cartoon making fun of his advisor Rasputin, this mystic, kind of crazy man that was despised by everyone, the church, the nobles, the peasants, but he really had a kind of hold over the Tsar and the Tsar's wife because he supposedly had the ability to heal their sickly son. But he's very unpopular. When he's assassinated, his assassins are celebrated. And the real crisis comes, of course, during the First World War, which is a complete disaster for the Russians. They're unprepared, they're overwhelmed militarily, they can't supply their troops, they can't supply people back home with food. They have terrible generals. The troops are poorly trained, and huge numbers of them are killed or surrender or desert. And so the crisis comes when Tsar Nicholas II personally takes command of the troops, and he blows it. He really can't do it. And so in the capital city of Petrograd, formerly known as St. Petersburg, there are bread riots that break out, and the Tsar is away from the capital city, and the people that are in charge really don't know what to do. And so when the troops on the front line hear about this, they're completely discouraged by what's happening on the front and what's happening back home. And the Russian army just kind of melts away. And the government falls apart. The police and the army are unable to put down the growing rebellion. And Nicholas II is forced to step down. He tries to get one of his relatives to take the throne, but that guy's too smart for it. He refuses. And so the Tsar has to step down. And so we then enter a moderate phase, just as in the early parts of the French Revolution. You have moderates who want to make some slight changes. They don't want to get rid of the monarchy. They want a constitutional monarchy. And this is led by the guy you see on the right here, Alexander Kerensky. He's an intelligent man. He's trained as a lawyer. He's a pretty good politician. But he makes a disastrous decision to continue the war. And he hopes that the soldiers now fighting for a cause they'll believe in will do much better. He launches an offensive, which is a complete and awful disaster. And the party he leads, the group called the Mensheviks, become quite unpopular. They're moderate socialists. And the stage is now set for a much more radical phase of the revolution with the failure of this moderate phase. So the initial revolution in March of 1917 had taken everyone by surprise, even the so-called professional revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, the more radical communists led by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, pictured here in the top left, more popularly known as Lenin. He was in exile at the time, and the Germans very helpfully managed to smuggle him back into Russia to stir up trouble, hoping to see an opportunity in the unrest in Russia. And so Lenin and his comrades, the Bolsheviks, quickly organize themselves into units and develop a plan to seize power from the moderates and take advantage of the incredibly unpopular decision that they've made to continue with the war. So in October/November of 1917, depending on which calendar you use, the Russians still stuck with the older form of the calendar, so to them it was October, to everybody else it was November. So in October/November of 1917, the Bolsheviks move. They quickly seize communication centers, transportation centers, government buildings, and they take power from the Mensheviks, and they begin to implement a much more radical policy. Now, a number of people are unhappy about this, and so once the radicals take power, they start pushing it, just as in the French Revolution, they started pushing it too far, making some rules that people didn't like, and so there's a pushback. There are people that try to seize power back from the radicals. And so this leads to a really horrible civil war, one of the most terrible events of the 20th century. Now, the communists know that they're going to have to fight against these whites, these people who are resisting their rule. And so they negotiate this treaty with Germany, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which is just abject surrender. But they focus on the war. And although it seems like the whites should have a lot of advantages, because most of the professional generals are on the side of the whites, and they really outnumber the Reds, the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are better organized, and they have internal lines of communication, and they're more unified. They have just one agenda, whereas the whites have a number of different agendas. So you have these two sides facing off, and the Western Allies try and help the whites. In fact, even the United States invades eastern Russia at the city of Vladivostok. But the Reds, as I say, they're pretty organized, and under the leadership of Trotsky, their military is fairly effective. They also have the dreaded Cheka, the secret police who rule through fear, and this is a very brutal war, and both the whites and the Reds carry out atrocities against their opponents. Now, during this civil war, the communists instituted something they called war communism. Basically, they said everything belongs to us, all the food, all the equipment, and even the labor of all the people. And so they could draft people into their military and take supplies and such. And this is, of course, very unpopular. And so Lenin comes up with a clever scheme to try and win over the people and win this civil war. He comes up with a simple three-word slogan, land, peace, and bread. And he also comes up with a policy called the New Economic Policy, which allows small-scale farmers and small businesses to own relatively modest amounts of property. And so this is enough to win people over to his side so that they can help win this war. Now, we'll never know if Lenin intended for this policy to be permanent or not, because he soon after suffers a series of strokes and dies. There's a power struggle to see who comes out on top, and this guy, Joseph Jugashvili, better known as Stalin, comes out on top. And he institutes a policy of confiscating land from these peasants who managed to scrape together these small holdings. And this is what's known as collectivization, to have the agriculture run by the central government. And this is resisted by many of the small farmers, and so Stalin murders millions of them through a policy of mass starvation in areas that resist his will. He also puts control of all industry under the state, these so-called 5-year plans where he plans out what the factories will get for resources and what they should produce in exchange. And he wants to focus on building up the Soviet Union as kind of an arsenal of communism, this idea of socialism in one country, that the Soviet Union will represent the strength of communism, and from there other communist revolutions will spread with the Soviet Union as their supporter. And with Stalin as the leader, this is the so-called cult of personality, where Stalin doesn't tolerate any rivals. He carries out these purges where he eliminates anyone that he thinks might rival him, and no one's supposed to question him at all. They're supposed to have pictures of him in their homes, and they're supposed to not question anything he has to say. He's a brutal dictator, and people under the Soviet flag have no political or economic freedom or intellectual freedom at all. He does succeed in building up the Soviet Union's industrial capacity, so when World War II breaks out, the Soviet Union is able to resist the German invasion. But this comes at a tremendous cost to people within the Soviet Union and within countries that the Soviet Union comes to dominate. All right, thanks for listening.